On April 13th, 1612, on a small island between Honshu and Kyushu, the greatest duel in samurai history took place. Sasaki Kojiro, considered Japan's most skilled swordsman, waited with his legendary blade called the Drying Pole. His opponent arrived late, stepped off the boat with a weapon he'd carved from an oar during the journey, and killed Kojiro with a single blow. That opponent was Miyamoto Musashi, and he never lost a fight in his entire life. By the time Musashi died at age 60, he had won over 60 duels to the death. But his legacy extends far beyond his undefeated record. He became a master painter, a sculptor, a calligrapher, and most importantly, the author of the Book of Five Rings, a text on strategy that's studied by everyone from business executives to military commanders 4 centuries after his death. This is the story of how an orphan child became the greatest samurai who ever lived, and how his philosophy continues to shape our understanding of combat, strategy, and excellence itself. The story of Miyamoto Musashi begins in mystery and tragedy. Born around 1584 in Miyamoto village in Harima province, the details of his early life remain frustratingly unclear. Even his birth date is disputed. Some records suggest 1582, others 1584. His childhood name was Benosuke, and from the very beginning, his life was marked by loss and hardship. His father was Shinmen Munisai, a skilled martial artist renowned for his mastery of the sword and the jita, a specialized truncheon used to catch sword blades. Munisai had earned recognition from powerful lords and was considered an accomplished warrior in his own right. But Musashi's relationship with his father was complicated and short-lived. His mother, whose name varies across historical sources, died soon after his birth, or possibly during childbirth. Munisai remarried, and young Musashi was raised by his stepmother, a woman named Omasa. By some accounts, Musashi's father divorced his first wife shortly after Musashi's birth, and she left him with Munisai before departing to her father's house. The boy grew up in a household that valued martial prowess above all else, but the warmth of a mother's love was something he would never know. This early loss shaped him in ways that would echo throughout his life. He would become a man who walked alone, who needed no one, who found comfort only in the perfection of his art. When Musashi was around 7 years old, something happened that changed his life forever. His father either died or abandoned him. The records are unclear. What is certain is that the young boy was sent to live with his uncle, a Buddhist monk named Dorinbo, at the Shorin temple near Hirafuku. This was not uncommon for the time. Temples often took in orphaned or abandoned children, giving them education and discipline in exchange for their service. At the temple, Dorinbo taught Musashi the fundamentals of Buddhism, reading and writing. These were essential skills that would later allow Musashi to become not just a warrior, but a philosopher and artist. But the education Musashi craved was not in books or meditation. His training in swordsmanship, which had begun under his father's harsh instruction, continued in a more informal way. The boy had an unusual build, larger and stronger than other children his age, and stories suggest he suffered from severe eczema that left his face scarred. Whether this made him more determined to prove himself, or whether it simply added to the anger and frustration building inside him, we cannot know. What we do know is that by the age of 13, Miyamoto Musashi had already decided his path. In 1596, a wandering samurai named Arima Kihei arrived in the region of Hirafuku. Kihei was a practitioner of the Kashima Shinto style of swordsmanship, and he posted a public challenge, a call for any warrior brave enough to face him in a duel. This was not unusual. Warriors traveled across Japan, honing their skills, seeking worthy opponents to test themselves against. What was unusual was the name that appeared on the challenge sheet: Benosuke, a 13-year-old boy. When a messenger arrived at Dorinbo's temple to inform Musashi that his challenge had been accepted, the monk was horrified. He knew his nephew had been training, but this was madness. Kihei was an adult warrior, armed with a wakizashi, a short sword with a razor-sharp edge. Musashi was a child with a wooden staff. Dorinbo begged Kihei to call off the duel, citing Musashi's youth, but the samurai refused. His honor had been challenged. The only acceptable resolution was combat or an apology. On the day of the duel, Dorinbo tried one last time to apologize on Musashi's behalf, but Musashi had no interest in apologies. Without warning, without formal greeting or ceremony, the boy charged at Arima Kihei with a 6-foot quarterstaff, screaming a battle challenge. Kihei, startled by the aggression, drew his wakizashi and slashed at the boy. But Musashi was already too close. He threw Kihei to the ground, and as the samurai tried to rise, Musashi struck him between the eyes with the staff. Then he struck him again, and again, and again. 14 or 15 blows in total, until Arima Kihei lay dead in the dirt, vomiting blood. This was not a clean kill. It was not a display of refined technique or masterful swordsmanship. It was brutal, savage, and absolutely effective. The killing of Arima Kihei revealed something essential about Musashi's character, something that would define every duel he fought for the rest of his life. The purpose of any fight is to win by any means necessary. Style, honor, tradition, all of these mattered nothing compared to victory. This freedom from convention, this willingness to abandon formal technique in favor of practical effectiveness, would become the cornerstone of Musashi's philosophy. After the duel, Musashi climbed the Kamo slope and left Miyamoto village. He never returned. At 13 years old, with one killing already on his hands, he became a shugyosha, a wandering swordsman in training. This was the first step toward becoming a fully realized samurai. For young warriors of the era, the Musha Shugyo, or warrior pilgrimage, was a rite of passage. They traveled the country seeking fights, battles, and duels, testing themselves against anyone willing to face them. For most, this period lasted a few years. For Musashi, it would become a way of life. The Japan that Musashi walked through was a nation emerging from chaos. He had been born near the end of the Sengoku period, the Warring States era, more than a century of nearly continuous civil warfare that had devastated the country. Regional warlords called daimyo-controlled independent domains, constantly fighting to expand their territories. For professional warriors like the samurai, combat was not theory or sport. It was life and death, and failure meant annihilation. But by the time Musashi began his wandering, things were beginning to change. The great warlords Oda Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi had begun the process of unifying Japan, bringing the warring provinces under centralized control. When Hideyoshi died in 1598, he left behind a power vacuum that would be filled by Tokugawa Ieyasu. The great battle that would decide Japan's future was coming, and Musashi would be there. In 1600, when Musashi was approximately 16 years old, war broke out between the Toyotomi and Tokugawa clans. The decisive engagement would be the Battle of Sekigahara, fought in October of that year. This was no mere skirmish. Over 160,000 warriors gathered on that battlefield, and by the time the sun set, more than 30,000 lay dead. Musashi fought on the side of the Western Army, loyal to the Toyotomi clan through his family's allegiance to the Shinmin. It was the losing side. The Battle of Sekigahara was a disaster for the Western forces. Betrayals, poor coordination, and the tactical genius of Tokugawa Ieyasu led to a complete rout. According to some accounts, Musashi's achievements on the battlefield stood out. His skill with the sword noticed even amid the chaos and carnage. But the Western army was defeated, and the survivors were hunted down. Musashi somehow escaped, though whether through luck, skill, or a combination of both, we cannot say. He survived when thousands did not, and this experience of large-scale warfare, of facing death alongside armies of men, shaped his understanding of combat in ways that personal duels never could. After Sekigahara, the young Musashi disappeared for a time. Some accounts suggest he retreated to Mount Hiko in southwestern Japan, a remote peak 1,200 meters high, where he trained in isolation, perfecting his technique and contemplating the lessons learned in battle. Whether this is true or legend is unclear, but what is certain is that when Musashi emerged from this period, he had evolved from a raw, brutal fighter into something more refined, more dangerous. By 1604, when Musashi was approximately 21 years old, he had developed enough confidence to take on the most prestigious sword schools in Japan. And that meant traveling to Kyoto, the old capital and spiritual heartland of Japanese martial arts. There, the most famous school was the Yoshioka family school, one of the 8 great schools of Kyoto. The Yoshioka clan had produced generations of legendary swordsmen, and their current masters were the brothers Yoshioka Seijuro and Yoshioka Denshichiro. Musashi's father, Musashi, had once been compared to the Yoshioka school by a shogun and had been declared superior, earning the title unrivaled under heaven. This created bad blood between the families, a simmering resentment that had never been resolved. When Musashi arrived in Kyoto and issued his challenge to the head of the Yoshioka school, he wasn't just seeking to prove his own skill. He was settling an old family score. Yoshioka Seijuro, the elder brother and head of the school, accepted the challenge. He was renowned for his powers of concentration, a meditation technique that gave him an edge in combat. On the morning of the scheduled duel outside Rendaji Temple on March 8, 1604, Seijuro spent time in his garden, focusing his mind. It was said he could fix his vision on a single bird in a treetop, and as he did, hundreds of other birds would fly to that same branch, drawn by the intensity of his focus. He was ready. But Musashi didn't show up. Hours passed. Seijuro waited, his carefully cultivated concentration beginning to fray. This was psychological warfare, a deliberate tactic that Musashi would use again and again throughout his life. Finally, when Seijuro's patience had been stretched to the breaking point, Musashi appeared, casual and unbothered. They faced off with bokutos, wooden swords. They had agreed to a single strike, a test of pure skill. Musashi moved first. One blow, one devastating strike to Seijuro's left shoulder. The impact knocked him unconscious and shattered the bones in his arm, crippling it permanently. Yoshioka Seijuro's defeat was total and humiliating. Unable to continue as head of the school, he resigned and became a monk. Leadership passed to his younger brother, Denshichiro, who immediately challenged Musashi to a rematch, this time a duel to the death. Musashi accepted, and once again, he arrived late. This time, Denshichiro wielded not a sword, but a staff reinforced with steel rings, a devastating weapon that could crush bone. It didn't matter, Musashi disarmed him and killed him. Now the Yoshioka clan was in crisis. 2 masters defeated, 1 crippled, 1 dead. Leadership fell to a 12-year-old boy named Musashi, but the clan had had enough of fair fights. They decided to ambush Musashi to restore their honor through treachery. Musashi challenged Musashi to a duel at night in a private location, and when the time came, he arrived with dozens of armed men. But Musashi had anticipated this. Instead of arriving late as he had in his previous duels, he arrived early, hiding near the dueling ground. When the Yoshioka forces appeared, expecting to ambush an overconfident opponent, Musashi struck first. He rushed from hiding, killed young Musashi with a single blow, then fought his way through the surrounding warriors. Accounts vary on how many he killed that night. Some say a dozen, others claim he cut down nearly 80 men. What is certain is that Musashi survived, and the Yoshioka school never recovered. Within a decade, they had abandoned the teaching of swordsmanship entirely. By the time Musashi left Kyoto, his reputation was established. In less than a week, he had fought 2 duels, survived an assassination attempt, and destroyed one of Japan's most prestigious martial arts schools. He was 21 years old, and he had already achieved what most swordsmen could only dream of. But his greatest test was still ahead of him. His name would soon be linked forever with another warrior, a man whose skill was said to equal his own, a master of the Nodachi, whose blade was so long it was called the drying pole. That man's name was Sasaki Kojiro, and their meeting would become the most famous duel in samurai history. The years between 1605 and 1612 marked the most intense period of Musashi's warrior pilgrimage. He wandered the length and breadth of Japan, seeking out masters, accepting challenges, and refining the technique that would eventually make him immortal. This was not mere wandering. It was Musha Shugyo, the warrior's quest for enlightenment through combat. Every duel was a lesson, every opponent was a teacher, and every victory brought him closer to understanding the true nature of strategy. During this time, Musashi developed the technique that would become his signature, the 2-sword style, eventually formalized as Niten Ichi Reu, which translates to 2 heavens as 1 school. The concept was revolutionary and went against everything traditional sword schools taught. Most samurai used both hands to grip a single katana, the long sword. This 2-handed grip provided power and control, allowing for devastating strikes. But Musashi saw a fundamental flaw in this approach. The samurai also carried a wakizashi, a shorter companion sword, strapped to their belt. If a warrior died with this weapon still sheathed, it meant they had not done everything possible to win. For Musashi, this was unacceptable. The development of his two-sword technique began around 1604 or 1605, shortly after his victories over the Yoshioka clan. But Musashi did not immediately use this style in public duels. He spent years perfecting it in private, experimenting with the mechanics of wielding a sword in each hand, building the strength required to fight effectively with divided attention. The katana in his right hand would deliver killing blows, while the wakizashi in his left could parry, deflect, or create openings. The two weapons worked in harmony, like two parts of a single instrument, but the philosophy behind Nitinichi Ryu went deeper than simple tactics. Musashi believed that overspecialization in any single weapon led to weakness. A swordsman who relied exclusively on a katana would be helpless in tight spaces, where the long blade couldn't be drawn. A warrior who favored only one type of attack would be predictable. True mastery meant understanding every weapon, every situation, every possible scenario. The two-sword technique embodied this principle. It was versatile, unpredictable, and devastatingly effective when properly executed. Musashi didn't formally unveil his two-sword style in combat until around 1614 or 1615, during the Osaka campaigns, when he fought a warrior named Miyake Gunbei. By that point, he had been perfecting the technique for nearly a decade. When he finally demonstrated it in a real duel, the effect was overwhelming. His opponents had never seen anything like it. The simultaneous attack and defense, the fluid transitions between strikes, the way he could control distance with two blades instead of one. It redefined what swordsmanship could be. But developing a revolutionary technique was only part of Musashi's journey during these years. He also fought some of the most dangerous opponents of his life, warriors who had dedicated themselves to mastering specific weapons or styles. Each duel taught him something new, refined his understanding, and brought him closer to the perfection he sought. One of his most significant encounters was with a warrior named Shishido Baiken, who specialized in the kusarigama, a weapon that combined a sickle with a chain and weighted ball. The kusarigama was designed to counter swordsmen. The chain could entangle a blade or strike from a distance, while the sickle could cut an opponent who got too close. Baiken was a master of this weapon, and facing him required Musashi to completely rethink his approach. The fight took place in Edo, and it demonstrated one of Musashi's most important principles: adaptability. Rather than trying to close distance in a conventional way, Musashi used his short sword as a projectile. Before Baiken could strike with his sickle, Musashi threw the wakizashi with such force and accuracy that it pierced Baiken's chest. He then closed the distance and finished him with the katana. The entire fight lasted seconds. Another crucial opponent during this period was Muso Gonosuke, who would later found the influential Shinto Muso Ryu school of staff fighting. Their first duel took place around 1605 in the Harima province at Akashi. Gonosuke fought with a traditional bio staff, approximately 1 meter 80 centimeters long. He was highly skilled, but Musashi defeated him. The loss devastated Gonosuke. He couldn't accept that his technique had been insufficient, so he retreated to Mount Homon in Kyushu and spent months in meditation and training, rethinking everything he knew about staff combat. When Gonosuke emerged from his retreat, he had created something new. He had shortened his staff to 1 meter 30 centimeters, creating the Jo, and developed a completely new fighting system that incorporated techniques from the spear, sword, and naginata. This shorter staff allowed for faster strikes and better maneuverability. When Gonosuke challenged Musashi again, something unprecedented happened. According to the traditions of both the Shinto Muso-ryu and Musashi's own school, Gonosuke managed to strike Musashi in the solar plexus, defeating him without causing serious injury. This remains the only recorded defeat in Musashi's entire life, and even then, the accounts are disputed. What is certain is that Gonosuke's innovative approach impressed Musashi enough that he acknowledged the effectiveness of the Jo technique. This encounter demonstrated one of Musashi's most admirable qualities: his willingness to learn from anyone, even in defeat. Musashi also traveled to Hosoin Temple in Nara, where warrior monks had developed one of Japan's most respected schools of spear fighting. The Hosoin style was famous for its lance techniques, and the monks were considered some of the finest spearmen in the country. Facing opponents with weapons that had far greater reach than his swords required Musashi to develop new strategies for closing distance and creating openings. These encounters forced him to think about timing in new ways, to understand the rhythm of combat at different ranges, and to recognize the psychological components of facing an opponent with a significant weapon advantage. Throughout his travels, Musashi fought with wooden swords, bakken, as often as he fought with steel. This was highly unusual. Most duels of the period were fought with live blades, where a single mistake meant death or crippling injury. But Musashi understood something that other warriors missed. A bakken in skilled hands was just as deadly as a katana, and it demonstrated absolute confidence in one's ability. When Musashi arrived at a duel wielding wood, while his opponent held steel, he was making a statement. "I don't need a razor-sharp edge to defeat you." The psychological impact of this was enormous. It filled opponents with doubt, made them question their own skill, and often caused them to make mistakes. But Musashi's use of the bakken was not just psychological warfare, it was also practical. Wooden swords didn't chip or break like steel blades could. They didn't require the same maintenance. And in the chaos of a real fight, where swords clashed and locked and scraped against each other, a well-made bakken could absorb impacts that would damage a katana's edge. Musashi understood that the weapon mattered less than the warrior wielding it. A master with wood could defeat a novice with the finest steel Japan could produce. As Musashi traveled and fought, his reputation grew. Stories spread of the undefeated swordsman who had destroyed the Yoshioka clan, who fought with two swords, who arrived late to duels and still won, who used wooden weapons against steel and emerged victorious every time. Warriors sought him out, not just to challenge him, but to learn from him. Young swordsmen hoping to make their own reputations saw Musashi as the ultimate test. Established masters wanted to prove that their schools and techniques were superior to this unconventional wanderer who refused to follow traditional forms. But Musashi's approach to combat was evolving beyond simple technical skill. He was beginning to understand strategy not as a set of techniques, but as a way of perceiving reality. He studied his opponents before fights began, looking for weaknesses in their character, patterns in their behavior, fears they tried to hide. He manipulated the conditions of duels to give himself advantages that had nothing to do with swordsmanship. His habitual lateness was not rudeness or disrespect. It was a calculated tactic to disrupt his opponent's mental state, to force them to wait while their anxiety and anger built, to ensure that when the fight finally began, they were already compromised. Musashi also began to understand the importance of environment. He would position himself so the sun was in his opponent's eyes, or so his opponent had to fight uphill, or so the terrain limited their movement while giving him more room to maneuver. These considerations seemed minor, but in a fight between two highly skilled warriors, the smallest advantage could determine who lived and who died. Musashi missed nothing. He observed everything, and he used every possible factor to ensure victory. During this period, Musashi also began to explore artistic pursuits. He practiced calligraphy, studied ink painting, and started to develop the aesthetic sensibility that would later define his later years. This might seem disconnected from his life as a warrior, but for Musashi, art and combat were inseparable. Both required perfect control, total focus, and an understanding of timing and rhythm. The stroke of a brush and the stroke of a sword followed the same principles. Both demanded that the practitioner empty their mind of distraction and act with complete presence. This concept of presence, of existing fully in the moment, became central to Musashi's philosophy. He called it the state of no mind, a condition where conscious thought disappeared and action flowed naturally, without hesitation or doubt. In this state, there was no gap between perception and response. The warrior saw an opening and struck simultaneously, with no delay for analysis or decision-making. Achieving this state required years of training, thousands of repetitions of the same movements until they became as natural as breathing. But it also required a certain attitude, a willingness to let go of ego and fear and exist purely in the reality of the present moment. By 1612, when Musashi was approximately 29 years old, he had fought over 60 duels and had never lost. His technique had been refined through constant testing against the best warriors Japan could offer. His two-sword style had been perfected to the point where it seemed less like fighting with two separate weapons and more like fighting with a single extension of his will. His understanding of strategy had deepened to encompass not just the technical aspects of combat, but the psychological, environmental, and even spiritual dimensions of conflict. And then he received the challenge that would define his legend. A message arrived arranging a duel with a warrior named Sasaki Kojiro, considered by many to be the greatest swordsman in all of Japan. Kojiro was everything Musashi was not. Where Musashi was rough and unkempt, Kojiro was refined and elegant. Where Musashi fought with wooden swords and unconventional techniques, Kojiro wielded a blade so long and so perfectly crafted, it was called the drying pole. Where Musashi had built his reputation through wandering and dueling anyone willing to face him, Kojiro held an official position as sword instructor to a powerful lord. He was the establishment's champion, the ideal samurai, the embodiment of everything traditional martial arts represented. Their meeting was inevitable. Two masters, two completely different philosophies, and only one could walk away. The duel was set for April 13, 1612, on a small island called Funajima, located in the strait between Honshu and Kyushu. The island would later be renamed Ganryujima after Kojiro's sword school. Everything Musashi had learned, every fight he had won, every technique he had mastered, had been preparation for this moment. The greatest duel in samurai history was about to begin. To understand why the duel between Miyamoto Musashi and Sasaki Kojiro became the most famous in samurai history, you first need to understand who Sasaki Kojiro was. He was not just another skilled swordsman. He was a phenomenon, a master whose reputation rivaled and possibly exceeded Musashi's own. Where Musashi was the wandering outsider, Kojiro was the establishment's champion. Where Musashi fought with improvised weapons and unconventional tactics, Kojiro embodied the pinnacle of traditional Japanese swordsmanship. Kojiro was also known as Ganryu, meaning large rock style, which was both his fighting name and the name of the sword school he founded. He had studied the Chujo-ryu style of swordsmanship, an ancient school founded in Kyoto during the Muromachi era that traced its lineage back to legendary masters. Some accounts say he learned from Kanamaki Jisai, others from Toda Saigen, a renowned master of the kodachi or short sword. If Kojiro had indeed trained under Saigen, an interesting dynamic would have emerged. Because his teacher specialized in short blades, Kojiro developed expertise in the opposite, the nodachi, an extraordinarily long katana. Kojiro's weapon was not just long, it was exceptional. The blade measured over 90 centimeters, significantly longer than a standard katana, which typically measured around 70 centimeters. Kojiro called his sword Monohoshizao, which translates to the laundry-drying pole or the clothes-drying pole, a name that suggested both its unusual length and Kojiro's confidence in wielding it. The extra reach gave him a tremendous advantage in combat. He could strike opponents before they could close distance, and the weight of the longer blade generated devastating power. But length also meant the weapon was heavier and more difficult to control. In the hands of anyone less skilled, such a blade would be clumsy, slow, inefficient. In Kojiro's hands, it moved with impossible speed and precision. His signature technique was called Tsubame Gaishi, which translates as swallow reversal or swallow return. The technique involved a deliberate downward slash that appeared to miss the target, followed by an immediate upward reversal to strike the opponent's neck, emulating the swift, agile maneuvers of a swallow in flight. The name came from Kojiro's observation of swallows, small birds whose tails flick instantly from side to side during flight, with almost supernatural speed. The technique mimicked that motion. The swordsman would swing toward the ground in what appeared to be a feint, making the opponent think it was a miss, then at the crucial moment turn the blade upward and swing back from the opponent's groin to chin. Because humans have difficulty defending against attacks from below, this technique was devastatingly effective. According to legend, Kojiro could perform the Tsubame Gaishi so fast that eyewitnesses and opponents could hardly see it or describe it, which accounted for his great success and opponents' difficulty in developing an effective counter. The speed was such that some claimed he could cut a swallow out of the air mid-flight. Whether this was literally true or poetic exaggeration, it spoke to the fear and respect Kojiro commanded. His technique had been refined through countless duels, and by 1610, his fame had spread throughout Japan. That year, Lord Hosokawa Tadaoki, A powerful daimyo who governed Higo province in northern Kyushu honored Kojiro by appointing him chief weapons master for the entire domain. This was an extraordinary position for any swordsman. It meant Kojiro was responsible for training the Lord's samurai, maintaining the martial readiness of the province, and representing Hosokawa's military prestige. For a warrior without noble birth or powerful family connections, this appointment was the pinnacle of success. Kojiro had achieved everything a swordsman could aspire to: recognition, position, students, stability. He was approximately 27 years old and at the height of his powers. By 1612, stories of both Musashi and Kojiro had spread across Japan. It was inevitable that people would wonder who was superior. The question could only be answered one way: through direct combat. Musashi, hearing of Kojiro's fame and position, wanted to settle the question definitively. He contacted Lord Hosokawa Tadaoki through an intermediary, Nagaoka Sado Okinaga, a principal vassal of the Hosokawa clan, and requested that the lord arrange a formal duel between himself and Kojiro. Hosokawa agreed, but there was a problem. Kojiro had many students and disciples in the region, loyal followers who revered their master and would not accept his defeat peacefully. If the duel took place in a populated area and Kojiro lost, Musashi would likely be killed by vengeful students before he could escape. So, Hosokawa chose a remote location: Ganryujima, a small boat-shaped island in the strait between Honshu and Kyushu. The island was originally called Funashima, which means boat island, but after the duel it would be forever known by Kojiro's fighting name, Ganryu Island. The date was set for April 13th, 1612, at 8 in the morning. On the morning of the duel, Kojiro arrived early with the official witnesses. He wore formal dueling attire and carried his magnificent nodachi in its ornate scabbard. He waited. 8 o'clock came and went. Musashi did not appear. 9 o'clock passed. Still no sign of his opponent. By 10 o'clock, Kojiro was seething with rage. When Musashi finally arrived, the officials of the duel, as well as Kojiro, were extremely irritated, and Kojiro was full of rage. This was Musashi's strategy, the same psychological warfare he had used against the Yoshioka clan. Arrive late. Let your opponent wait. Let their anger build. Let their concentration fragment. Let doubt creep into their mind. By the time the fight begins, they're already compromised. But Musashi had been doing more than simply making Kojiro wait. During the boat ride to the island, he had been crafting his weapon. Using his wakizashi, he carved and shaped one of the boat's oars into a bakken, a wooden sword. But this was no ordinary bakken. The finished weapon was approximately 110 centimeters long, significantly longer than a standard wooden sword. It was longer even than Kojiro's famous nodachi. Musashi understood the importance of reach, and he had just given himself a decisive advantage. When Musashi's boat finally reached the shore, he stepped into the shallow water and waded toward the beach, holding his oversized bakken behind his back. Kojiro's anger erupted. Some accounts say he screamed insults. Others say he simply drew his sword in fury and threw the scabbard aside into the water, a gesture of absolute commitment. There would be no sheathing his blade again. One of them would die here. Musashi, seeing the discarded scabbard, smiled and made a comment that has echoed through history. He said to Kojiro, "If you have no more use for your sheath, you are already dead." The psychological impact was perfect. Kojiro, already enraged by the weight, was now being mocked for his anger. He had been manipulated into abandoning the calm, centered mindset that made him so dangerous. His legendary technique required precision, timing, perfect control. Rage was the enemy of all those things. The duel began. Both warriors took their stances, a moment of respect for each other's skill, despite everything that had preceded it. Then Kojiro attacked. His blade flashed toward Musashi with all the speed and power that had made him famous. The strike came so close that it severed Musashi's headband, cutting through the cloth and sending it fluttering to the ground. For a fraction of a second, Kojiro must have thought he had won. His blade had passed within millimeters of Musashi's skull, but Musashi had already moved. What happened next is disputed in the various historical accounts, but the outcome is not. One version says that as Kojiro came close to victory several times, he was eventually blinded by the sunset behind Musashi, who then struck him on the skull with the oversized bakken. Another version describes a different sequence. Kojiro attempted his famous swallow's blade technique, but Musashi's oversized bakken hit Kojiro first, causing him to fall down, and before Kojiro could finish his swallow cut, Musashi smashed Kojiro's left rib, puncturing his lungs and killing him. The critical factor was timing and reach. Musashi's wooden sword, being longer than Kojiro's steel blade, allowed him to strike first. The extra length, combined with Musashi's perfect understanding of distance and timing, meant that Kojiro's attack, no matter how fast, would never land. Musashi struck Kojiro in the head, a devastating blow that stunned him. As Kojiro fell, unable to complete his legendary technique, Musashi followed with a second strike to the ribs, a blow so powerful it crushed bone and punctured the lungs beneath. Kojiro collapsed to the beach and died. Musashi stood over his opponent's body for a moment, then bowed to the official witnesses. Without ceremony or celebration, he walked back to his boat and left the island. The entire fight had lasted seconds. Lord Hosokawa's retainers later examined Kojiro's body. The damage from Musashi's wooden sword was catastrophic. The blows had shattered bone and caused massive internal trauma. A wooden weapon in the hands of a master had proven deadlier than the finest steel blade Japan could produce. The duel at Ganryujima became instant legend. It contained everything that made samurai combat compelling. Two supreme masters, radically different styles and philosophies, psychological warfare, tactical brilliance, and a definitive outcome. But beyond the drama and the violence, the duel illustrated several profound truths about Musashi's approach to combat and strategy. First, Musashi understood that victory begins long before blades clash. His late arrival, his taunting words, his visible weapon preparation during the boat ride, all of these were calculated to disrupt Kojiro's mental state. A warrior who fought angry, fought carelessly. By manipulating Kojiro's emotions, Musashi had already gained an advantage that no amount of technical skill could overcome. Second, Musashi recognized that the weapon matters less than the warrior. He fought with wood against steel and won because he understood distance, timing, and psychology better than his opponent. The bakken allowed him to claim the moral high ground. It demonstrated supreme confidence, and it gave him the reach advantage he needed. Kojiro's beautiful, legendary sword ended up being irrelevant because he never got close enough to use it effectively. Third, Musashi's willingness to break convention gave him an edge that traditional training could not match. Kojiro had spent his life perfecting techniques within an established system. His Tsubame Geishi was the culmination of traditional Chujo-ryu training, refined to near perfection. But Musashi didn't care about tradition. He cared about winning, by creating a weapon specifically designed for this duel, by arriving late to disrupt his opponent's preparation, by saying exactly the right words to maximize Kojiro's rage. Musashi demonstrated that strategy exists outside the formal structures of martial arts schools. The death of Sasaki Kojiro sent shockwaves through Japan's martial arts community. The man who had been considered the finest swordsman in the country, the chief weapons master of a powerful lord, the founder of his own school, had been killed by a wandering warrior with a piece of carved wood. The establishment had been defeated by the outsider. Traditional technique had fallen before adaptive strategy. It was a lesson that would resonate for centuries. For Musashi, the duel represented something else: validation. He had defeated the one opponent whose reputation matched his own. There was no one left to challenge. He was 30 years old, and he had fought over 60 duels without a single loss. His two-sword technique had been proven in combat against the best warriors Japan could offer. His understanding of strategy had been demonstrated in the most public and definitive way possible. But the duel also marked a turning point. This was the last time Musashi would kill an opponent in a formal duel. He had proven everything that could be proven through violence. The question that remained was, what would he do with the decades of life still ahead of him? How would the greatest swordsman in Japan spend his years when there were no more opponents worth fighting? The answer would surprise everyone who knew him. The brutal warrior who had killed Kojiro on Ganryujima would transform into something no one expected: an artist, a philosopher, and the author of one of the most influential texts on strategy ever written. After the death of Sasaki Kojiro on Ganryujima, something unexpected happened. Miyamoto Musashi, the man who had built his entire identity around combat, who who had spent his life seeking out opponents and testing himself through violence, stopped dueling. He was 30 years old, and except for one later engagement that was more of a tactical demonstration than a true duel, he would never again kill another man in single combat. The question was, what does a warrior do when there are no more battles to fight? The transition was not immediate. In 1614 and 1615, Japan experienced its last great civil conflict before the establishment of lasting peace under the Tokugawa shogunate. The siege of Osaka pitted the forces of Tokugawa Ieyasu against the remaining supporters of the Toyotomi clan, a final settling of accounts that had been brewing since Sekigahara. Musashi participated in these sieges, though his exact allegiance remains unclear. Some accounts place him fighting for the Tokugawa, others suggest he supported the Toyotomi cause one last time. Given that powerful Tokugawa loyalists would later become his patrons, it seems likely he fought for the winning side. But by this point in his life, Musashi's reputation was such that his service was valued, regardless of past allegiances. During the Osaka campaigns, Musashi demonstrated his two-sword technique in actual warfare for the first time, fighting a warrior named Miyake Gunbei. The encounter showed that Niiten Ichiryu was not just effective in formal duels, but could be applied to the chaos of battlefield combat. But these battles also marked the end of an era. After Osaka, the Tokugawa clan established complete dominance over Japan. The age of civil war was finished. For warriors like Musashi, this created a fundamental problem. Peace eliminated the very conditions that had given their lives meaning. In 1615, Musashi entered the service of Lord Ogasawara Tadanao of Harima Province, taking on the role of construction supervisor. This might seem like an odd occupation for the greatest swordsman in Japan, but it reflected a reality of peacetime. Samurai skills were no longer needed for warfare. They had to find other ways to serve their lords and earn their stipends. Musashi applied himself to this work with the same intensity he had brought to dueling. He helped design and oversee the construction of Akashi Castle, learning the principles of architecture, engineering, and urban planning. The strategic thinking that had made him unbeatable in combat translated surprisingly well to the planning of fortifications and the layout of castle towns. During this period, Musashi also adopted a son, Miyamoto Mikinosuke. The boy was a talented martial artist, and Musashi taught him his techniques, hoping to pass on the Niiten Ichiryu to the next generation. But in 1626, tragedy struck. Mikinosuke's lord died, and following the practice of junshi, death in service to one's lord, the young man committed seppuku, ritual suicide. For Musashi, who had already lost his father, his mother, and lived most of his life alone, this must have been devastating. The student he had trained, the son he had adopted, had chosen death over life. It was a stark reminder that the samurai code, for all its emphasis on honor and loyalty, could exact a terrible price. Around this time, Musashi adopted another son, Miyamoto Iori. Unlike Mikinosuke, Iori would survive to old age and achieve considerable success, eventually rising to the position of Karo, essentially a minister under the Ogasawara clan. But the loss of his first adopted son seems to have affected Musashi deeply. He began to reconsider what it meant to live as a warrior in an age when warfare had ended. The answer he found was in art. Musashi had been practicing calligraphy and ink painting since his youth, but after the Kojiro duel and the end of the civil wars, these pursuits became central to his life. He studied sumi-e, the Japanese art of monochrome ink painting, a technique that used only black ink and water to create images of startling simplicity and power. The style was closely associated with Zen Buddhism and emphasized spontaneity, directness, and the capture of essential form with minimal brushstrokes. For Musashi, who had spent his life eliminating unnecessary movement from his swordsmanship, this aesthetic philosophy resonated deeply. His paintings focused primarily on nature, birds, flowers, landscapes. One of his most famous works is Koboku me Kakuzu, which translates to shrike perched on a dead tree. The painting depicts a small bird, a shrike, sitting on a bare branch. The brushwork is bold and confident, with no hesitation or correction. Every stroke is deliberate and final, exactly like a sword cut. The bird's eye is rendered with a single dot of ink, yet it conveys an intense watchfulness, a predatory alertness that seems to embody Musashi's own philosophy of awareness and readiness. The bare branch suggests winter, death, the stripping away of all ornamentation to reveal essential structure. It's a painting about survival, about the fierce determination needed to endure in a harsh world. Another celebrated work is Rosanzu, which depicts wild geese among reeds. The geese are caught in a moment of stillness, yet there's an underlying tension in the composition, a sense that at any moment they might explode into flight. The reeds bend in an invisible wind, their leaves rendered with swift, assured strokes that capture both their flexibility and strength. These were not decorative paintings meant to please wealthy patrons. They were philosophical statements, meditations on the nature of existence rendered in ink and water. Musashi also excelled at painting Hotei, the laughing Buddha, a figure associated with happiness and abundance. In one famous work, Hotei observes two roosters fighting, his expression one of amused contemplation. The painting illustrates the concept of the observer, someone who can watch conflict without being drawn into it, who can learn from violence without participating in it. For Musashi, who had spent his entire youth immersed in combat, this represented a profound evolution. He had become the observer, the one who could see the patterns and principles underlying conflict without needing to engage in it personally. In 1621, Musashi demonstrated that his martial skills had not diminished despite his focus on art. At the arrangement of the Lord of Himeji, he faced Miyake Gunbei and 3 other practitioners of the Togun Ryu style. Musashi defeated all 4 of them, showcasing the superiority of his two-sword technique even against multiple opponents. But these demonstrations were rare. Increasingly, Musashi's reputation came from his art rather than his swordsmanship. In 1627, Musashi began traveling again, restless despite his artistic success. He journeyed to Nagoya, where he sought employment with the Owari Tokugawa clan. The Lord Tokugawa Yoshinao was impressed enough to grant Musashi permission to establish a dojo teaching his Enmei Ryu style. The school flourished. During the first 4 years, approximately 3,000 samurai from Nagoya Castle came to study with Musashi. This was extraordinary. Despite the establishment of peace, warriors still recognized that Musashi's understanding of combat was unparalleled, and they wanted to learn from him. But Musashi's attempts to become a formal vassal to powerful lords repeatedly failed. He remained a ronin, a masterless samurai, throughout his life. Whether this was by choice or circumstance is unclear, but it meant he retained a freedom that most samurai lacked. In 1633, Musashi received an invitation that would shape the final years of his life. Hosokawa Tadatoshi, the daimyo of Kumamoto Castle, invited him to stay as a guest. Tadatoshi was the son of Hosokawa Tadaoki, the lord who had witnessed the duel between Musashi and Kojiro on Ganryujima 21 years earlier. The younger Hosokawa had inherited his father's appreciation for the martial arts, but he was also a patron of painting, calligraphy, and poetry. For Musashi, this was an ideal situation. He could train students in swordsmanship while also pursuing his artistic interests in an environment that valued both. Musashi settled in Kumamoto with his adopted son Iori, and for the next several years lived a relatively peaceful life. He painted, taught students, and occasionally provided strategic advice to the Hosokawa clan. In 1634, at the arrangement of Lord Ogasawara, he fought his final recorded duel against a lance specialist named Takada Matabe. Musashi won, demonstrating that even in his 50s, his skill remained supreme. But this was more of a formal demonstration than a fight to the death, a showcase of technique rather than genuine combat. In 1637, Musashi's martial expertise was called upon one more time, but in a very different context. A rebellion had broken out on the Shimabara Peninsula, led by Christian peasants and ronin, who were protesting religious persecution and oppressive taxation. The rebellion became known as the Shimabara Rebellion, and it required a massive military response from the Tokugawa shogunate. Lord Ogasawara Tadazane, who governed the region, called on Musashi to serve as a strategist, directing troops rather than fighting personally. This was Musashi's last engagement in warfare, and it revealed how completely his role had transformed. He was no longer the young warrior charging into battle, sword in hand. He was now the elder strategist, the tactical advisor whose understanding of combat could guide armies. During the siege of Hara Castle, where the rebels had fortified themselves, Musashi directed operations and provided counsel. He was wounded during the siege, struck by a stone thrown from the castle walls, a reminder that even strategic planning carried risks. But his contributions helped bring the rebellion to an end, and afterward, he returned to Kumamoto. In 1640, Musashi's relationship with the Hosokawa clan was formalized. Lord Tadatoshi officially made him a retainer, granting him 17 servants, a stipend of 300 koku of rice annually, and Shiba Castle in Kumamoto as his residence. This was a significant position, roughly equivalent to a modern upper-middle management role. For a man who had spent most of his life wandering, who had never held a permanent position or owned significant property, this represented security and recognition. He had finally found a place where he belonged, not as a warrior who solved problems through violence, but as a respected elder whose wisdom and skill were valued. In 1641, Musashi wrote his first book, the Hyoho Sanju Go, which translates to the 35 Instructions on Strategy. He composed this work for Hosokawa Tadatoshi, distilling decades of experience into a concise manual on martial arts and tactical thinking. The book covered both the physical techniques of swordsmanship and the mental disciplines required for victory. It emphasized the importance of understanding rhythm, of perceiving an opponent's intentions, of maintaining calm under pressure. Many of the concepts introduced in this first work would be expanded upon in his later, more famous text. By 1642, Musashi's health began to decline. He experienced what contemporary accounts describe as neuralgia, possibly related to nerve damage or degenerative disease. The attacks were painful and debilitating, a harsh reminder that even the greatest warrior could not defeat age and illness. Musashi knew his time was limited, and he decided to spend his remaining years creating something that would outlast his body, a comprehensive philosophy of strategy that could guide future generations. In 1643, at the age of 60, Musashi retired to Reigando, a cave on the outskirts of Kumamoto. The cave was cold, damp, isolated. It offered no comforts, no distractions, nothing but stone walls and silence. There, in conditions that would have broken most people, Musashi spent 2 years writing his masterpiece, Go Rin no Sho, the Book of 5 Rings. He painted when the light was good, practiced calligraphy to keep his hands steady, and wrote by candlelight through the long nights. The work he produced in that cave would become one of the most influential texts on strategy ever written, studied not just by martial artists, but by business leaders, military commanders, and anyone seeking to understand the principles of competition and conflict. The warrior who had killed his first opponent at 13, who had destroyed the Yoshioka school, who had defeated Sasaki Kojiro with a piece of wood, was spending his final years as a hermit, an artist, and a philosopher. The transformation was complete. Musashi had evolved from a brutal fighter into something far more complex, a master who understood that true victory came not from destroying opponents, but from understanding the fundamental principles underlying all conflict. The sword had been replaced by the brush, but the precision, the focus, the absolute commitment to mastery remained unchanged. In 1643, at the age of 60, Musashi withdrew to Reigando, a cave in the mountains near Kumamoto. His health was failing, his body weakened by decades of combat, and a life lived without comfort or compromise. He knew death was approaching, and he had one final task to complete. Over the next 2 years, living alone in that cold, isolated cave, he would write the work that would make him immortal. Go Rin no Sho, the Book of 5 Rings. The title came from Buddhist cosmology, specifically the concept of the 5 elements that compose all existence: earth, water, fire, wind, and void. These elements were not just physical substances, but represented different aspects of reality, different ways of understanding the world. Musashi structured his final work around these elements, using them as frameworks to explore strategy, combat, and the nature of conflict itself. What he created was not simply a manual on swordsmanship, it was a comprehensive philosophy of strategy that could be applied to any competitive situation, from individual combat to large-scale warfare to the challenges of daily life. The Book of Earth serves as the foundation, the introduction to everything that follows. Here, Musashi establishes the basic principles of his philosophy and explains the fundamental concepts underlying his approach to strategy. He uses the metaphor of building a house, comparing the warrior's path to the work of a carpenter who must understand materials, tools, and construction before creating anything of value. He emphasizes that strategy is not about memorizing techniques or following rigid forms. It's about understanding principles that can be adapted to any situation. In the Earth Book, Musashi outlines 9 essential principles that form the ground upon which all strategy must be built. Know the smallest things and the biggest things, he writes. Understand what is shallow and what is deep. See the world clearly, without illusion or self-deception. These principles are practical, worldly, intended to help develop an understanding of strategy before moving into the specific tactics and movements described in later books. He insists that students must train daily, practicing not just physical techniques, but also developing the mental disciplines required for victory. The way of strategy, he explains, is not found in spectacular displays or elaborate ceremonies. It exists in the simple, direct, efficient application of force to achieve a specific objective. Musashi also addresses the importance of choosing the right tools and understanding their capabilities. Every weapon has strengths and weaknesses, he notes. The long sword excels in open spaces and large-scale battles. The short sword is better for confined quarters or close-range fighting. Relying exclusively on any single tool creates vulnerability. A true strategist must be versatile, comfortable with multiple weapons and multiple approaches. This principle extended beyond physical weapons. It applied to tactics, to timing, to every aspect of conflict. Flexibility, adaptability, the ability to shift approaches when circumstances change, these were the hallmarks of mastery. The Book of Water follows, and here Musashi describes his specific martial techniques and the principles of his two-sword style, Niten Ichi Ryu. The choice of water as the metaphor is deliberate and profound. Water demonstrates natural flexibility. It changes shape to conform with whatever boundaries contain it, always seeking the most efficient and productive path. A warrior must possess this same quality, the ability to adapt to changing circumstances, to flow around obstacles rather than crashing against them. Musashi describes the proper mental state for combat. The warrior must be determined yet calm, he writes. Meet every situation without tension, but also without recklessness. The spirit should be settled yet unbiased, ready to respond to whatever emerges without preconceived expectations about what should happen. This concept of remaining calm under pressure appears throughout the book. Musashi understood that fear, anger, overconfidence, and attachment to specific outcomes all compromise a warrior's effectiveness. The mind must be like water, clear, reflective, responsive, but never disturbed at its depths regardless of what happens on the surface. In the Water Book, Musashi also details specific techniques. He describes the proper grip on the sword, neither too tight nor too loose, like holding a bird that you don't want to fly away, but also don't want to crush. He explains footwork, how to position the body, how to strike with maximum power, while maintaining balance and readiness for the next movement. But even as he describes these technical details, Musashi constantly reminds readers that techniques are merely tools. The principle is what matters. Once you understand the principle, you can execute 1,000 variations. Without understanding the principle, memorizing 1,000 techniques means nothing. One of the most important concepts in the Water Book is what Musashi calls the state of no mind. This is not emptiness or absence of thought. It's a condition where conscious deliberation disappears and action becomes spontaneous, flowing directly from perception without the delay caused by analysis or hesitation. In this state, the warrior sees an opening and strikes in the same instant, with no gap between recognition and response. Achieving this requires years of training until every movement becomes as natural as breathing. The body knows what to do, without the mind having to direct it. This allows for speed and precision that conscious thought could never match. The Book of Fire deals with combat itself, the heat of battle where strategies are tested and lives are won or lost. Fire represents intensity, aggression, the moment of decisive action. Here Musashi discusses timing, one of the most critical concepts in all of strategy. Timing, he writes, exists in everything. In music, in dance, in martial arts, in commerce, in the rise and fall of nations. Understanding timing means recognizing when to act and when to wait, when to attack and when to defend, when to press an advantage and when to withdraw. Musashi identifies several types of timing. There is the timing of initiative, striking before your opponent is ready. seizing control of the engagement before it begins. There is the timing of the void, striking in the brief moment when your opponent transitions between actions and is momentarily vulnerable. There is the timing of the repeat, attacking again and again in rapid succession to overwhelm defenses. There is the timing of surprise, doing the unexpected to create confusion and openings. A master must understand all these types of timing and know which is appropriate for each situation. The Fire Book also addresses the importance of understanding rhythm, both your own and your opponent's. Every warrior has a natural rhythm, a pattern to their movements and decisions. By observing this rhythm, you can anticipate what they will do next and disrupt it. If your opponent attacks with a fast rhythm, respond with slowness to break their momentum. If they fight cautiously with a slow rhythm, attack with sudden speed to overwhelm them before they can respond. The goal is to impose your rhythm on the situation while preventing your opponent from establishing theirs. Musashi describes various strategic approaches for different combat scenarios. When fighting multiple opponents, he advises keeping them in front of you rather than allowing them to surround you, and dealing with them one at a time rather than trying to fight all simultaneously. When fighting in confined spaces, use weapons and techniques appropriate to the environment. When facing an opponent of superior skill, use surprise, deception, or manipulation of the environment to create advantages. Victory, Musashi insists, is never about fairness or following rules. It's about winning by any means necessary while staying true to the principles of strategy. The Book of Wind takes its name from a deliberate wordplay in Japanese. The character for wind can also mean style, as in a style of martial arts or a school of thought. In this book, Musashi critiques the various contemporary schools of swordsmanship that existed during his time, examining their philosophies and pointing out what he considers their fundamental flaws. This might seem like mere criticism of rivals, but Musashi's deeper purpose is to illustrate the importance of understanding different approaches, studying how others think and fight, so that you can recognize the limitations of any single system. Musashi criticizes schools that favor extra-long swords, arguing that reliance on reach alone represents weakness. He condemns schools that emphasize speed above all else, noting that speed without control is useless. He critiques styles that focus exclusively on technical flourishes and elaborate movements, stating that ornamentation has no place in real combat, where the only thing that matters is cutting down the opponent. He takes issue with schools that have favorite techniques or preferred methods, because such preferences create predictability and vulnerability. The underlying lesson of the Wind Book is that understanding your opponent's way is essential to mastering your own. You must know what others believe, what they practice, what they prioritize, so you can exploit their assumptions and attack their weaknesses. But you must also recognize that every system, including your own, has inherent limitations. The moment you become attached to a particular technique or approach, you've created a blind spot that a skilled opponent can exploit. True mastery requires transcending all fixed systems, being able to adapt and respond fluidly rather than following predetermined patterns. Musashi warns against overspecialization. Some schools teach only indoor fighting, others only outdoor combat. Some focus on one-on-one duels, others on battlefield warfare. All of these approaches have value in their specific contexts, but a warrior who can only fight in one way will be helpless when circumstances change. The principle of adaptability appears again and again throughout Musashi's work. Strategy is not about having a single perfect technique. It's about having the judgment to choose the right approach for each unique situation. The Book of the Void is the shortest and most enigmatic of the 5 books. Here, Musashi moves beyond technique and tactics into the realm of philosophy and spirituality. The void represents that which cannot be seen, that which exists beyond conventional knowledge and understanding. It is the state of absolute freedom, where the mind is empty of preconceptions, attachments, and distractions. In this state, the warrior can perceive reality clearly, without the distortions created by fear, desire, or expectation. Musashi describes the void as a place of pure potential, a space that can be filled with any number of possibilities. When you exist in the void, you can see all options clearly and choose the best course of action without being influenced by your own desires or preconceptions. This is the culmination of martial arts mastery, the point where technique becomes unnecessary, because the warrior simply acts correctly in each moment, responding perfectly to whatever emerges. Achieving the state of the void requires two things. First, you must seek knowledge of all things. You must study broadly and deeply, understanding not just martial arts, but every aspect of life, because true strategy applies to everything. Second, you must train constantly, putting principles into practice every day until they become inseparable from your nature. Knowledge alone is insufficient. Understanding alone is not enough. Only through relentless practice can you internalize principles so thoroughly that they operate automatically, without conscious thought. Musashi writes that, by knowing things that exist, you can know that which does not exist. By understanding what is, you can perceive what is not. This sounds paradoxical, but the meaning is clear. True mastery includes the ability to recognize absence, to perceive what's missing, to understand not just what your opponent is doing, but what they are not doing, where the gaps in their defense exist, where the opportunities lie hidden. The void is not emptiness. It is awareness of potential, recognition of possibility, understanding that extends beyond the visible and tangible into the realm of intuition and immediate perception. The 5 books together form a complete philosophy of strategy. From the earthly foundation of basic principles, through the fluid adaptability of water, the decisive action of fire, the critical analysis of wind, to the transcendent awareness of the void, Musashi maps out a path to mastery that begins with practical technique and culminates in something approaching enlightenment. But he never loses sight of the fundamental purpose. All of this philosophy, all of these principles, all of this training exists for one reason: to win. Strategy is not abstract theory. It is the art of achieving victory in conflict. Whether that conflict involves swords or armies or business negotiations or any other competitive situation. When the Book of 5 Rings appeared in Japan, it immediately gained recognition among martial artists and military strategists, but its influence expanded far beyond the world of combat. By the 20th century, Japanese business leaders had begun studying Musashi's work, recognizing that his principles of strategy applied perfectly to the competitive world of commerce. The emphasis on understanding your opponent, adapting to changing circumstances, choosing the right timing, avoiding overspecialization, all of these concepts translated directly into business strategy. When Western translations of the Book of 5 Rings began appearing in the 1970s, the book found an enthusiastic audience among American and European business executives. Wall Street traders studied Musashi's principles of timing and rhythm. Corporate strategists applied his concepts of adaptability and initiative. Entrepreneurs recognized in his work a philosophy that valued practical results over theoretical purity, that emphasized winning through superior understanding rather than superior resources. Modern military academies teach the Book of 5 Rings alongside Sun Tzu's Art of War and Clausewitz's On War, recognizing that Musashi's insights into the nature of conflict remain relevant centuries after his death. Sports psychologists use his concepts of mental preparation and maintaining calm under pressure. Negotiators apply his principles of understanding an opponent's rhythm and imposing your own timing on interactions. The book has been translated into dozens of languages and has sold millions of copies worldwide. What makes the Book of 5 Rings endure is not just the brilliance of its strategic insights, but the authenticity of its author. Musashi wasn't a theoretician speculating about combat from the safety of a monastery. He was a practitioner who had tested every principle he described through 6 decades of duels, battles, and conflicts where failure meant death. His philosophy emerged from lived experience, refined through constant testing against the most dangerous opponents Japan could offer. When Musashi writes about timing or adaptability or maintaining calm under pressure, he speaks with the authority of someone who survived situations where a single mistake would have been fatal. The book also endures because its principles transcend their specific historical context. Musashi wrote for samurai in 17th century Japan, but the challenges he addresses, how to make effective decisions under pressure, how to adapt when circumstances change, how to recognize and exploit an opponent's weaknesses, how to maintain focus and discipline over long periods, these are universal challenges that every person faces in every competitive situation. The details change. The weapons we use, the battles we fight, the opponents we face, all are different from Musashi's time. But the underlying principles remain constant. In his final weeks in Reigando Cave, completing the Book of Five Rings, Musashi must have known he was creating something extraordinary. He was 62 years old, dying, living in isolation and discomfort, writing by candlelight with hands that had once wielded swords with unmatched skill. He had spent his entire life pursuing perfection in strategy, testing himself against every opponent he could find, refining his understanding through victory after victory. And now, in these final months, he was distilling all that experience, all that knowledge, all those hard-won insights into a text that would outlive him by centuries. The warrior who had killed his first opponent at 13, who had destroyed the Yoshioka school, who had defeated Sasaki Kojiro with a piece of wood, was ensuring that his wisdom would continue to guide and teach long after his body had returned to dust. On the 10th day of the second month of 1645, Miyamoto Musashi emerged from Reigando Cave for the last time. He had completed the Book of Five Rings, and he knew his death was imminent. His body, weakened by what historians believe was thoracic cancer, could no longer sustain the discipline and austerity he had imposed on himself for 2 years. He returned to his residence at Chiba Castle in Kumamoto, where his students and adopted son, Iori, waited to care for him in his final days. But Musashi had one more task to complete. In the last week of his life, he wrote a second work, shorter and more personal than the Book of Five Rings. He called it Dokodo, which translates as The Path of Aloneness, or The Way of Walking Alone. Where the Book of Five Rings had been a comprehensive manual on strategy intended to teach others, Dokodo was something different. It was Musashi's final statement on how to live, a distillation of everything he had learned through 60 years of combat, meditation, and relentless self-examination. He dedicated this work to Terao Magonojo, his most skilled disciple in Nitanichi Ryu, the same student to whom he had given the Book of Five Rings. Dokodo consists of 21 precepts, each a single line, each containing an entire philosophy. Accept everything just the way it is. Do not seek pleasure for its own sake. Do not, under any circumstances, depend on a partial feeling. Think lightly of yourself and deeply of the world. Be detached from desire your whole life long. Do not regret what you have done. Never be jealous. Never let yourself be saddened by a separation. Resentment and complaint are appropriate neither for oneself nor others. Do not let yourself be guided by the feeling of lust or love. The precepts continued, each one revealing Musashi's worldview. In all things have no preferences. Be indifferent to where you live. Do not pursue the taste of good food. Do not hold on to possessions you no longer need. Do not act following customary beliefs. Do not collect weapons or practice with weapons beyond what is useful. Do not fear death. Do not seek to possess either goods or fiefs for your old age. Respect Buddha and the gods without counting on their help. You may abandon your own body, but you must preserve your honor. The final precept synthesized everything that came before it. Never stray from the way. This was Musashi's ultimate instruction. Choose your path with absolute clarity and walk it without deviation, without compromise, without allowing desire or fear or comfort to pull you away from what you know to be right. For Musashi, the way was not a set of techniques or a collection of rules. It was a commitment to constant improvement, absolute honesty, and living in accordance with your deepest understanding of truth. These precepts were harsh. They demanded complete self-discipline, total detachment from worldly concerns, acceptance of hardship and loss. But Musashi had lived them. He had walked alone his entire life, never marrying, never accumulating wealth, never allowing himself to be softened by comfort or distracted by pleasure. The Dokodo was not theory. It was the record of how one man had actually lived, the principles that had guided him from his first duel at 13 to his death at 62. Writing it in his final week, knowing he would never see another spring, Musashi was offering future generations a map of the path he had walked. On the 19th day of the 5th month of 1645, corresponding to June 13th in the Western calendar, Miyamoto Musashi died. Some accounts say he passed away peacefully, surrounded by his students. Others suggest he died alone, as he had lived. What is certain is that he faced death with the same calm acceptance he had brought to every other challenge in his life. He had killed his first opponent at 13. He had fought over 60 duels and never lost. He had survived the Battle of Sekigahara and the Siege of Osaka. He had destroyed the Yoshioka school and defeated Sasaki Kojiro. He had created a revolutionary style of swordsmanship, painted masterpieces, and written texts that would influence strategy for centuries. And now, at 62, he was ready. After Musashi's death, his students ensured that his legacy would endure. Deao Magonojo became the second master of Nitanichi Ryu, passing down the techniques and philosophy to new generations of students. The school continued to grow, establishing dojos throughout Japan. Today, more than 375 years after Musashi's death, Niten-ichi Ryu is still practiced. The 12th generation master, Yoshimochi Kiyoshi, maintains the tradition in Okayama Prefecture, teaching the same two-sword techniques that Musashi developed in the early 17th century. But Musashi's influence extended far beyond his own school. His paintings, which he had created as a form of meditation and artistic expression, were recognized as national treasures. Works like Shrike Perched on a Dead Tree and his various depictions of Hotei are preserved in museums and private collections, studied by art historians and admired by visitors who know nothing of his martial accomplishments. The fact that Musashi excelled at both warfare and art, that he could kill with absolute efficiency and also create beauty with absolute precision, fascinated people. He embodied a paradox that Japanese culture has always valued: the warrior who is also a poet, the killer who is also an artist, strength combined with refinement. The Book of Five Rings slowly gained recognition after Musashi's death, first among martial artists who recognized its value as a manual on combat strategy, then more broadly as Japan modernized and business leaders began looking for competitive advantages. When American occupation forces arrived in Japan after World War II, some officers discovered the book and brought copies back to the United States. By the 1970s, English translations were becoming available, and the Book of Five Rings found an enthusiastic audience in the West. Business executives saw in Musashi's principles a philosophy perfectly suited to corporate competition. The emphasis on understanding your opponent, adapting to changing circumstances, choosing the right timing, avoiding over-specialization, all of these concepts translated directly to the challenges of running a company in a competitive market. Wall Street traders applied Musashi's teachings on rhythm and timing to financial markets. Technology entrepreneurs used his principles of innovation and unconventional thinking to disrupt established industries. Military academies began teaching the Book of Five Rings alongside Sun Tzu's Art of War, recognizing that both texts offered insights into conflict that transcended their specific historical contexts. The Dokudo also gained followers, particularly among people seeking a philosophy of self-reliance and discipline. Modern readers found in its 21 precepts a stark alternative to consumer culture and the endless pursuit of comfort and pleasure. Musashi's insistence on detachment from desire, on indifference to possessions and sensory pleasures, on maintaining honor above all else, resonated with those who felt modern life had become too soft, too distracted, too focused on temporary satisfactions. Martial artists, athletes, entrepreneurs, anyone pursuing mastery in any field found inspiration in Musashi's example of absolute commitment and relentless self-improvement. Musashi also became a cultural icon in ways that had nothing to do with his historical reality. In 1935, Japanese novelist Eiji Yoshikawa began serializing a fictionalized account of Musashi's life in the Asahi Shimbun newspaper. The serialization ran for 6 years and was eventually published as a novel simply titled Musashi. Yoshikawa's version portrayed a somewhat romanticized Musashi, focusing on his spiritual growth and transformation from a violent young warrior into an enlightened philosopher. The novel became one of the best-selling books in Japanese history, introducing Musashi to millions of readers who would never have encountered the historical figure. Films followed. Directors created numerous adaptations of Musashi's life, focusing particularly on his duel with Kojiro. The 1954 film trilogy starring Toshiro Mifune became especially famous, presenting a cinematic version of Musashi that influenced how generations of Japanese and international audiences imagined the legendary swordsman. Anime and manga artists drew on Musashi's story, creating characters inspired by his undefeated record and philosophical approach to combat. Video games featured Musashi as a playable character, his two-sword technique translated into digital combat mechanics. This cultural proliferation meant that Musashi the legend often overshadowed Musashi the historical figure. The real man, violent, ruthless, willing to use any tactic to win, was smoothed into a more palatable hero. His psychological warfare, his deliberate manipulation of opponents, his willingness to kill without hesitation, these aspects were downplayed in favor of emphasizing his artistic achievements and philosophical wisdom. But perhaps this transformation was inevitable. Every culture needs heroes, and heroes must embody values that inspire future generations. The brutal killer who carved a weapon from an oar and bashed Kojiro's skull in would not serve as well as the warrior philosopher who transcended violence to achieve enlightenment. Yet the historical Musashi remains valuable precisely because he was not a sanitized hero. He was a man who lived in brutal times and responded with brutal effectiveness. He killed his first opponent at 13, not with elegant technique, but with savage, overwhelming force. He destroyed the Yoshioka school through a combination of skill and psychological manipulation. He defeated Kojiro by arriving late, taunting him, and using a weapon specifically designed to give him an advantage. These were not the actions of the enlightened sage. They were the tactics of someone who understood that survival required every possible edge, that winning was the only thing that mattered, that honor and fairness were luxuries a warrior could not afford. But Musashi also evolved. The man who retired to Ryagando Cave was not the same person who had killed Arima Kihei 50 years earlier. Decades of combat had taught him that violence, while sometimes necessary, was not the ultimate expression of human potential. He had proven his superiority as a swordsman beyond any possible doubt. There was nothing left to prove through dueling. So he turned to art, to philosophy, to teaching. He dedicated his final years to ensuring that the principles he had learned through a lifetime of conflict could benefit people who would never face an opponent with a sword. This is why Musashi's legacy endures. Not because he was undefeated in 60 duels, though that remains impressive. Not because he created a unique style of swordsmanship, though Niten Ichiryu continues to be practiced. Not even because he wrote influential books, though the Book of Five Rings and Dokudo remain widely read. Musashi endures because his life illustrates a truth about human potential, that mastery in any field requires absolute commitment, that excellence demands sacrificing comfort and conventional living, that true understanding comes from direct experience rather than abstract theory. Musashi's teachings remain relevant because the challenges he addressed are universal. How do you make effective decisions under pressure? How do you adapt when circumstances change? How do you recognize and exploit an opponent's weaknesses? How do you maintain focus and discipline over long periods? How do you continue improving when you've already achieved success? These questions matter to a samurai facing an opponent with a steel blade, but they also matter to an entrepreneur building a company, an athlete preparing for competition, a student pursuing education, anyone striving to achieve something difficult. The path Musashi walked was harsh. It demanded loneliness, constant vigilance, rejection of pleasure and comfort, willingness to face death repeatedly. Most people cannot and should not attempt to live as Musashi lived, but his example offers something valuable. Proof that human beings are capable of extraordinary things when they commit themselves completely to a goal, when they refuse to make excuses or accept limitations, when they pursue mastery with absolute dedication. In modern Japan, Musashi is remembered at several historical sites. Ganryujima, the island where he fought Kojiro, has become a tourist destination where visitors can stand on the beach and imagine that legendary duel. The Musashi Museum in Okayama displays artifacts related to his life, including some of his paintings and calligraphy. Ryagando Cave, where he wrote the Book of Five Rings, remains accessible to pilgrims and tourists who want to see where the great work was created. These sites serve as physical connections to a man who lived 4 centuries ago, tangible evidence that Musashi was not merely a legend, but a real person who walked the same earth we walk today. But Musashi's true legacy exists not in museums or tourist sites, but in the minds of people who read his words and find in them guidance for their own struggles. the young martial artist studying Musashi's techniques to improve their fighting ability, the business executive applying his principles of strategy to corporate competition, the student reading Dokudo and finding inspiration to pursue their goals without compromise, the athlete learning from his example of relentless training and constant improvement. All of these people, across centuries and cultures, connect to Musashi through the ideas he left behind. This is the ultimate victory, more significant than any duel. Musashi's body returned to dust in 1645, but his mind, his philosophy, his understanding of strategy and conflict and human nature, these continue to exist. Every person who reads the Book of Five Rings, who studies his paintings, who attempts to apply his principles to their own challenges, extends Musashi's life beyond the 62 years his body survived. He becomes immortal, not through supernatural means, but through the only immortality humans can achieve, influence that persists across generations. The greatest samurai who ever lived was not great merely because he never lost a fight. Musashi was great because he understood that excellence requires more than physical skill. It demands mental discipline, strategic thinking, constant adaptation, and above all, absolute commitment to improvement. His life, from his first brutal killing at 13 to his peaceful death at 62, from the savage warrior who destroyed the Yoshioka clan to the philosopher who wrote the Book of Five Rings, illustrates the full range of human potential. We remember Miyamoto Musashi not as a perfect hero, but as a complex man who pursued mastery with an intensity few people could match, and who left behind a legacy that continues to challenge, inspire, and guide those who seek excellence in their own lives.